Welcome to Launch, the GCC podcast. I'm your host, Marty Duran, Director of Communications for the Great Commission Collective. We're a global network of churches partnering together to plant churches and strengthen leaders. Clint Clifton joins Dave Harvey today on this episode of Launch. Clint is the pastor and founder of Pillar Church in Dumfries, Virginia. He's the co-founder of the Iceland Project, the co-founder of the Praetorian Project. He's worked with North American Mission Board as the director of Send BC, founded the New City Network, part of McLean Bible Church ministry in 2015. He's an author, having written Church Planting Thresholds, a gospel-centered church planting guide, and a podcaster at the Church Planting Podcast. I know you're going to enjoy this conversation today between Dave Harvey and Clint Clifton.
You know, Marty, God has been kind to me to give me a deep bench of friends that I can call for help in thinking through issues of church planting, network leaderships, things like that. But from that bench, Clint Clifton has been one of the most helpful voices. He brings experience, he brings penetrating study, and he's a local church guy. He's got a pastoral orientation. And this is one of the reasons I called Clint earlier this week. And in that call, we talked about organizational dynamics, movement dynamics, but then our discussion together kind of dropped into a pocket of what it looks like to build an ecosystem to incubate church planters. And I thought it was fascinating, and I thought that might be a good thing for us to talk about. But let me just back up first. Clint, thanks for joining us this morning.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here, Dave.
So, Clint, tell us and tell our listeners, tell us about your church, where it meets, and please, for our benefit, tell us about the church plants that your church is responsible for, because you dropped into this a little bit the other day, and
yeah,
it's fascinating.
Well, I feel a little like I get to talk about my kids, in this regard. I'm super happy to talk about my kids, and this feels like a really similar discussion. So I love this topic, and we'll talk about it for hours if you want. But yes, my church. So I have an interesting kind of journey to get to church planting. I'm from a non-Christian family, and or family that didn't exercise their faith very well. And then we moved in next door to a pastor, and he shared the gospel with my family. My parents were converted, and I was we had sort of alcoholism in our family, and my mom was handicapped, and it was just a blended family too, stepsister and biological sister. And it was just kind of a messy situation. And in all of that, the gospel started infiltrating my household, and I wasn't interested at first until such time as I became a teenager and started noticing there were young women at church, and so I was all of a sudden interested in going to church and meeting up with some of those gals, and I went there in pursuit of a relationship, and ultimately found Jesus more alluring than any gal I met there. And so, I became a Christian in that church. Is a small church. It was actually the church that Billy Graham was baptized and ordained in. It's called Peniel Baptist. It's in a little town called Palatka, Florida, and North Florida. And God really used that church in my life in incredible ways. They became family to me. I was like a son to the church. The people were helping me on all sorts of fronts. People in the church bought me a car and discipled me and educated me, and just so many wonderful memories of those early years. And God used that time in my life really to catapult me into ministry. My pastor, when he started discipling me, he would meet with me before school on Monday mornings, and he would start to develop me for pastoral ministry, even as a brand new Christian. And he was talking about church planting. He was zealous about church planting too. He was sending like Sunday school classes away to start new churches in our community and around. And I just saw this like really zealous work going on in kind of nooks and crannies of our town and community. And it really got under my skin, and I became really passionate about that. And so I started off initially leading worship in church plants. And so that's what I did, both of my undergraduate and master's degree are in music. And I thought that would kind of be my pathway. But along the way, became more interested in church planting.
So it was part of the genetics of the church that you were kind of converted into, and that became part of your DNA. What kind of things were they doing to encourage that? And what kind of things did he do with you to bring that forward?
Yeah, he's still a good friend today. His name's Danny Williams. He's pastoring a different church. But he's just, he became passionate about church planting because he was on vacation one week and he went off to go to church just on a Sunday morning and drove for, as he tells the story, 17 miles down A1A in Florida and didn't see a church along the way. And his response was, this is sin. This is wrong. There's too many people here. It shouldn't be this way. And he went back to the church he pastored and said, we got to do something about it. And they said, well, what are you going to do? And so he just went out and found a pastor and he sent some people over and they started a church. And that church sort of exploded in growth. And then he's like, hey, we did it once, we can do it again. And they started doing that and they just sort of got addicted to it. By the time I became a Christian and really got in the church's life, they were super committed to church planting and they had done it a few times and been very successful every time they've done it. Most of the churches they planted outgrew them by far. And so I just kind of I became a Christian in that. And so he saw me as a bullet for the gun. I think when I became a believer, he just like, oh, you're young, you're zealous, you're halfway competent. You could probably be a future church planter. And so he started training me as such. Okay.
So let's fast forward to where the bullet hit and where you started a church and tell us about that.
Yeah. So, long story short, I went to college and seminary and then I got my first legitimate job. I'd only done church plants before that. I'd been kind of a worship guy in church plants. And, I got my first legitimate job as a music minister at a real, church that had like a choir and an ensemble and the whole 9 yards. And I was,
wow, I did not know that about you.
Yeah. It was a whole different day. And in that church, I mean, I was there for all of 6 weeks when I realized I'd made a grave mistake. All I had done is been a part of new upstart things. And I had viewed that as illegitimate. I was working in that like farm system just to get to the big show. And I got to the big show and it was a whole different religion. It felt like to me. I mean, it was like all of a sudden it wasn't about like, the same things. It wasn't about evangelism and discipleship and sort of fundamentals and reaching people wherever they are. And it was about something different. It was about like a lot of structures and systems and rules I didn't get or understand about things you were supposed to wear and where you were supposed to be and what you're supposed to say. And I was just like overwhelmed by how not excited I was about this situation. So it was like the most anticlimactic first job you could possibly get, although the people there were kind. And I remember sitting down with the pastor, who's a gentle man, a godly man, and saying to him, I don't think this is going to work out. Thank you for this opportunity, but I think I need to just go and do something else. And he said, no, you don't. If you go start a church right now, it'll be a train wreck. You need to stay here, mature, grow. Plus, you're going to have to convince Christians to be involved in this kind of work with you. You need time to understand this, And I did. I stayed there for I negotiated with him. How long do I have to stay? And he said the deal was you stay for 3 years. You help us get our worship ministry on track, and we're gonna help you plant a church. And that's exactly what happened. And I stayed there 3 years, almost to the day. And then I said, okay, I'm ready to go. And he was certainly ready for me to go by that point. And he sent me out with, he gave me the pulpit one Sunday and I preached my heart out and asked people to go with me. And we planted a church 10 miles north of there. That was Stafford, Virginia. We planted a church 10 miles north at the headquarters of the United States Marine Corps. That's Quantico. And I was trying to convince the Marines in the congregation to go with me. And I convinced 10 people to go, none of them Marines. And so that was our start.
Okay, so along the way, then that DNA that you had to plant churches began to be transmitted to the church, and the vision for church planting emerged early on, and you guys began to plant churches. Talk a little bit about that process of planting churches and what's happened since then.
Yeah, so Dave, it was so cool to, like, in that stage of my life. Again, I'm 23, 24 years old, and I'm dreaming about, like, I know what I'm not now, and I'm trying to figure out what I am, and what I am is, a little a apostolic. I feel like that now that I know the Ephesians 4:12 kind of fivefold leadership of the church kind of ministry, I see myself very much in the A category, the apostle category, and I just always wanting to start new things and initiate new things and bring the gospel to new places. And I saw Quantico as I had been close enough to Quantico in proximity to see this incredible potential that was there. And the potential was, the Marine Corps is the finest leadership training institution in the world from my point of view. And their headquarters was right next door to me. And they trained these fantastic leaders. And Marines are either, there's no such thing as like a nominal Christian Marine. They're either like reprobates, or they're fully devoted to Jesus, heart, mind, soul, and strength. And I loved that. I so wanted to be a part of something where the distinction was clear. And then on top of that, as if those two things weren't good enough, on top of that, the Marine Corps sends people all over the world on Uncle Sam's dime. And so they train great leaders, send them all over the world. I thought, holy smokes, has nobody else noticed that this is like the best missional opportunity that maybe has ever existed? And so I feel like I saw something that other people didn't see, and I felt like it was an opportunity to go there and plant a church. The problem was I'm an overweight musician who doesn't know anything about military life, and with facial hair, and I only run if someone's chasing me. I've never shot a gun. That's who I am as a person. So why would God call me to the bastion of manlyhood, the Marine Corps? And I just, I seem to be the only person that didn't notice the distinction there. Everybody I told, hey, I'm going to plant a church at Quantico, I think now in hindsight, they were probably thinking, I don't think that's going to work. And so it was hard. Yeah. And that's what happened. We went there and we tried to plant the church, and the first couple of years was really, really hard. Super committed to church planting. But facing the reality that I can't even get this church rooted. I can't get the basics going. I can't get a service happening and small groups happening. And so ran into the reality of how difficult church planting was. And then I sort of had to make a choice. Am I going to continue on this trajectory of multiplication, trying to rapidly multiply on the backs of U.S. Marines, or am I going to sort of press pause, so that I can focus on my energy on stabilizing the church? And I at that point, even as a small, young, struggling church, what I couldn't get away from was the stark reality of the Great Commission, that is, that teaches us that no matter your size or your budget or your power, every church has a responsibility to enact and take action on the Great Commission. And so I don't get to pause my Great Commission involvement in order to stabilize my church. God's responsible for stabilizing my church. I'm responsible for obedience. And so I started developing leaders for the church planting harvest, even as we were a tiny church. We planted our first church about 9 months into after our launch, and we basically split our little congregation in half. And then every year since then, we've planted at least one new church, and we're about to have our 16th birthday in March of this year. Next year.
Fantastic. So the majority of those church plants have gone to other places where there've been some kind of Marine base or installation. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So the amazing thing about this work is, normally you get to strategize where you're going to go. But in this case, it's so like God's sovereign hand makes the decision for you where you're going to go. There are 12 or so Marine Corps installations around the world, and there are some well-worn paths between Quantico and other installations based on the Marine's MOS, or his sort of job assignment. And so Marines often go to the same places over and over again. And so every summer we'll have, depending on the size of our congregation, we'll have a a portion of our congregation, say 8% of our congregation goes to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, and 3% of our congregation goes to Camp Pendleton in Southern California, and one family goes to 29 Palms, and one family goes to Kaneohe, Hawaii, and 3 families go to Okinawa, Japan. They all go to the same places over and over again. So it only made sense to begin noticing when inordinate sized groups were headed to the same base at the same time, and to capitalize on that movement. It also only made sense to say to the rest of our congregation, go to your monitor, which is the person who's responsible for determining your assignment, and tell them you request to go to this place where we're planting a church. And those sorts of things started to formulate. And as I became more familiar with the Marine Corps and how it works, and I saw more and more and more opportunities for the gospel to be carried on the backs of those Marines.
I love the missional creativity and adaptivity that's displayed in the story of your church and the church planting. Ultimately became a church planting network, the Pillar, right?
Yeah, we the Pillar is the name of our churches. All of the churches are independent, autonomous churches, self-governing, got their own elders, and we're Pillar Church of in the community right outside the base. So my church is Pillar Church of Dumfries. We're planting right now Pillar Church of Stafford. There's Pillar Church of Oceanside and Pillar Church of Okinawa. So there's all the churches are named after the community, but they're right outside of an installation. And the network really is we call the Praetorian Project.
Okay. Clint, let's say a senior pastor is listening, or an elder, and he wants to help their church plant churches, but doesn't know where to start. So he's sitting across from you right now and saying, Clint, what steps should I take? What should I be doing? What are you telling him?
Well, I'm going to warn you. I'm intensely practical. I'm probably one of the most practically minded pastors you'll interact with. I'm not known for my intelligence. I'm known for my practicality. So I'm just going to shoot straight with some very practical things you should start doing immediately. Number one, first and foremost, you should teach from the Bible that God commands us to plant churches. So what is the biblical rationale for church planting? Is there an articulate version of that you can study and discover and then teach to people? The people of God are motivated by the word of God. So if we teach God's people that the Great Commission is a call to start new churches, then they'll see obedience to the Great Commission, which they already believe to be a necessity, as exercised in church planting. Right now, most pastors and most Christians see the Great Commission and church planting as two separate issues. But when Jesus said, go, baptize, teach, make disciples, given the fact that the church is the only institution on the planet that baptizes, teaches, and makes disciples, Jesus must have been discussing church planting when he commanded us to go do those things. That's one piece of rationale. Another one,
when we see Acts, it's apparent that was the result. That was how they applied the Great Commission.
That's where I was going next.
Okay,
the apostles, the original hearers of the Great Commission, their response to Jesus's command to go baptize, teach, and make disciples was, as recorded for us in Acts, was to plant new churches. So if the apostles heard Jesus speak and responded with church planting, and we hear him speak and we respond with anything other than church planting, who is it that misunderstood the Great Commission? It's probably us. So the Great Commission is 100% an explicit call to plant new churches. And if you're teaching your people that the Great Commission is anything other than a multiplication of local churches, then you're misteaching them. So it's the bullseye of the Great Commission. It is the bullseye of the Great Commission exercise in church planting. So for number one, the biblical rationale, your people have to become fluent in the knowledge that church planting and the Great Commission are one and the same. So I think that is maybe the most critical component. And when people believe that and see that, they start to see church planting all throughout the New Testament. All of a sudden, it's not a group of random letters to churches. It's a group of letters to church planters from a more experienced church planter. It's the book of Acts is not just the story of the church, it's the story of the foundation of the church and the advance of the church through the apostles. And so the scripture, the New Testament specifically, comes into, it's viewed differently. It's seen differently by the people in your church. And you can highlight, every time you're teaching from the New Testament, you can highlight, that so-and-so was a church planter and so-and-so was a church planting team member. I mean, there's so many, it's almost like it's so obvious in the New Testament that we miss it. It's like we miss the forest for the trees, so to speak. So that the biblical rationale is huge. Another thing is just praying for churches, other churches, not just church plants, but other churches. Right now, most American Christians sort of see their church as the best church and other churches as sort of competitors, so to speak. They wouldn't say it that explicitly like that, but they want their church to succeed and they don't really care about other churches succeeding. But that's not really the way the kingdom is, right? I mean, so we need to be praying for the fruitfulness and success of other churches in our community. And as we do so, we say, to our congregation that we're on a big team. We're just a small part of a big team that's working to advance the kingdom of God, his kingdom come. And so we can pray for other churches and church planters regularly. I think every single worship gathering, there should be a few moments dedicated to praying for the success of other churches in our community. And our church has done that from the very beginning, and it will do something to your people that you won't see immediately, but over time it'll form a culture of receptivity and sensitivity to the success of other churches, which will be to the good of the kingdom.
And it creates global Christians rather than people that are fixated on what their church is doing, because it's pushing vision and scope out appropriately beyond the local church.
Yeah. The other big bucket, I would say, I could give you probably 15 of these, but let me just go with the top 3. The other big bucket is the way we relate to those who are qualified for pastoral ministry is I think, really wrong and kind of sideways. I think the way we think about it is who's called, and when they're called, I'll equip them. And I just feel like that is just not what we're taught to be and do as pastors. Ephesians 4, the bullseye of the pastor's job description is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. It doesn't say equip the called for the work of the ministry. And who's to determine the called anyway? Calling works itself out in time and circumstance. What we're called to do is equip people for ministry. So what I want to do in my church is I want to say to every man in my church that has potential to be a pastor, I want to equip you so that if God in the future places you somewhere and begins to call you, then you have already received some of that equipping because you spent time here. So I think pastors think way too much about calling and not nearly enough about equipping. And so I feel like it's, we have intentional efforts to do all kinds of discipleship in our churches, except for the discipleship of future pastoral leaders. Yeah. And so I think a major category in every church should be, how are we producing new pastors? And so I want to be saying to my people, so we have around our church, we do things like preaching labs. We say, come learn to preach, everybody, just bring it on. We want lots and lots of capable preachers. We want lots of people that don't feel nervous to stand in front of a crowd and say, thus saith the Lord. And we just want to do that. What if just tons of men and women in our church could do that, and the women found context to do that biblically, and the men found context to do that biblically, and it was just a deep bench of equipped leaders. And in a particular way, there's a really cool thing that happens when a pastor goes to a person in his congregation who has a particular gifting, and he highlights that to them. So let's pretend, Dave, that you're a member of my church and you're serving well, you're loving your wife, you're evangelizing your neighbors, you're bringing your coworkers to service, you're using your house for hospitality and kingdom work. You're just being a daggum good Christian. And I'm your pastor. I'm probably going to text you and say, hey, Dave, I have something really serious I want to talk to you about. Do you think you'd have a little bit of time for us to hang out sometime in the near future? And you'd text me back and say, sure, whenever you want, name the place and time. And I'd say, hey, let's meet at IHOP on Saturday morning. And you say, anything I need to be worried about or anything I need to prepare for? And I say, no, it is a serious conversation, but let me just share it with you when I get there. And you say, okay. And then we sit down at IHOP. You're anxious.
Paranoid.
Yeah, you're paranoid. You've been thinking about it all week. Oh, no, what did I do? Is he going to rebuke me? We show up at IHOP and we sit down and I say, Dave, I just want to give you the bottom line up front. I've been watching you from afar, and I noticed that you're godly. You take the word of God seriously. You love your wife in an exceptional way, an exemplary way. You shepherd your kids. You share the gospel with your neighbors, and all those things are things that pastors do. I mean, you are a pastor. You've got pastoral gifts, and I don't know if God would ever call you to the pastoral ministry, but I want you to know as your pastor that if he did call you, I'd be eager to help you. And even if he doesn't call you, I'd be eager to equip you so that you could be ready to serve the Lord in any capacity. I know you're in the military and you're probably going to move somewhere else pretty soon. Who knows what context God will place you in Iraq or Afghanistan or Germany or Europe. Who knows where you'll be? I want you to be ready and equipped to share the gospel. And
this is a really important point, and I think particularly for any listeners that are leading in a church or senior pastors or elders, you have responsibility. One of the things that Clint is pulling out here is that for men who are called, there's an active work of grace in their life that's bringing forward the qualifications that we see in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. So I remember doing a study on the verbs there and recognizing, wow, the implication here is that God has set to Timothy and Titus, God has set these men in the church, and you'll see them by virtue of these things, hospitable and all the things that are listed there, because the grace of God has been at work in their life. And also sometimes it'll surface through their aspiration. It's interesting that Paul starts with a commitment to or with a recognition of aspiration. If anybody aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble thing. So the pressure's not on you altogether to identify. It's not just about leadership identification. The good news is there's grace at work, that the Spirit of God is at work. He's creating these qualities in men that will come to your attention, like Clint was saying.
Yeah, and it's so many pastors that I know say phrases like, we just don't have anybody to send, like we don't have anybody called. And I just say, like, they don't believe they play any role in the calling process. A pastor, an elder in a church, a pastor, a teaching elder, whatever word you use to describe it, generally doesn't see themselves as playing a critical role in the calling of somebody. Now, I'm going to tell you this, the reason our church has planted so many churches is because I've had dozens and dozens and dozens of those breakfast conversations that I just described. And every time I see God's gifts emerging in somebody pastorally, I tell them about it. And I tell them about it in a way that says to them, this is my job as a pastor. It's to equip you for ministry. And so I don't want there to be any ambiguity or confusion about what I'm willing to do to get you ready to serve the Lord with all of yourself.
Well, first, you're an interpreter for them of what's going on and that the activity of the Spirit in their life. Mm-hmm. And then, you're equipping them and training them. But I love the fact that you're referencing these meetings, because these breakfast meetings, because that's really important. You weren't passive about that, but you were looking over the church. You're seeing where the Spirit of God is at work, where these qualities are becoming evident. You're sitting down with guys and interpreting that for them and creating a category in their mind that a generally humble guy is not going to be assigning to himself.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's the thing. The kinds of guys that have those pastoral qualities, they're also not generally the kinds of guys that, if they have an aspiration, they necessarily trumpet it. They're the meek and the humble and the kind of, So another thing about that is I just absolutely love the process of being the soil in which someone is called to serve the Lord. I love being at the beginning of the process with somebody because, certainly our church could start a residency and we could like invite people in and prepare them for a year or two, but they're really already developed and called somewhere else. And to me, that feels like cheating. Like what I got into ministry to do was to create more ministry, not to just like find somebody that had been developed by someone else and put my sticker on them. I really want there to be, I want to be an agent of change. And so when I go to a person who's a Marine or a truck driver or anything else and talk to them like this, if over a 5 or 6 year period of time or 2 or 3 year period of time, I convert them into a fruitful pastor, then boy, I have just multiplied myself in exponential ways for the future, maybe even generations, especially if I teach them to do the same thing in terms of entrusting faithful men, entrusting this teaching to faithful men. So
that's great. Clint, let me make this my last question, but it sure is an important one. You were talking about praying for other churches, and I have a cohort on leading leaders, and a guy yesterday was sharing with us, Robbie Simons was teaching us on cultivating a church planting culture. And in it, one of his 4 points was there must be a kingdom conviction. Mm-hmm. And so you're talking about praying for other churches every Sunday morning, which is such a loud statement about how the kingdom is bigger than us. Mm-hmm. and you're promoting the kingdom. And I actually, when I think about how you roll in general, this seems to be a category. We met because you reached out to me to do a podcast. I wasn't part of your tribe or anything mm-hmm. like that. So here's my question. Why is a kingdom vision so important for leaders who are trying to build a church planting culture?
Well, you can't do it otherwise. I mean, I think without a kingdom vision, church planting doesn't make sense. But what I find is even those who have a kingdom vision, they don't have a lot of models to look to about what the appropriate way is to exercise a kingdom vision. That's why I emphasize the practical components of pray in your worship service and talk about church planting. I'll give you this is a commercial of sorts, but I'll give you a super practical way that is in that first category, the biblical rationale category, that we have. I wrote a thing called the Church Planting Primer, and it's basically just a 4 sessions course you can offer in your church. It's totally free. You can download it from newcityplanting.org, and the course is 4 sessions. First session is the biblical rationale for church planting. Second session is the need for new churches in our context. The third is how new churches begin in the New Testament. And then the last one is how everyday Christians can be involved in starting new churches. And so what I found is when you sit down with Christians who love God and love his word and describe this stuff and explain it, it's a no-brainer. Like they're on board. Very rarely do I have a conversation about church planting with somebody and they don't walk away going, yeah, you're totally right. This is something we should dedicate ourselves to. I mean, it's an education piece. Not many pastors are talking like that. So if you need some language or help, I'd love to help with that. I know you've got resources on that too, but the Church Planting Primer is the reason we made it. And the reason we made it totally free is that we hope churches will just use it liberally. For that kind of
excellent purpose. So that's newcityplanting.com.
.org.
Where guys can get that.
Yeah, and it's just on the courses page. You'll just find it, and it's video based, so you can download it and show the videos. If you don't feel competent to teach it, let me teach it. If you do want to teach it, then the manuscript teaching guide is in there. All the PowerPoints are in there. I mean, you just do the whole thing yourself.
Okay, well, we'll have Marty drop that link into the show notes and maybe on the Facebook page as well. Clint, as expected, this was an excellent conversation. Thank you so much for giving us your time and your help and just for modeling these things. I mean, this is what we want to be. We want to be church planting churches, and that's something you've done, and we're grateful to God for that.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it. If I can, I'll make 2 commercials. One, the military church planting ministry that I was just talking about. You can find out more about that at praetorianproject.org. Praetorianproject.org. And also, I do podcasts weekly on the subject of church planting at the Church Planting Podcast, and that's churchplantingpodcast.org. And of course, you can find it at all the platforms.
Excellent. Thank you, Clint.
Thanks, David.
Thank you for listening to Launch, the GCC podcast. If you haven't subscribed already, why not take a moment to do that in your favorite podcast app? Also, rate and review the podcast when you get a moment. That helps us with search results, and recommend us to your friends, maybe other pastors that you know who will benefit from the content from this podcast. Also, don't forget to check out our website if you haven't done that already. It's gccollective.org. That's gccollective.org. And there's a lot of helpful information. There's articles. There's how you can join the GCC, whether a church planter or an existing church, and plenty of other content that'll help you grow spiritually and encourage you in your leadership journey.